The first time Marcus Williams died, he was wearing a $1,000 suit and signing a contract worth £12 million. The second time he died was in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped like digital mourners. But the third time Marcus Williams died, well, that's when he learned to live again, pushing a mop bucket down the corridors of the very building that bore his name. 23 floors above the basement where he now sorted recycling, a bronze plaque still gleamed beside the executive lift. Williams and Associates, founded 1987. Nobody bothered to read it anymore, just like nobody bothered to look at the bent figure and faded coveralls who appeared each morning at 5:30, when London's streets were still drunk on yesterday's ambitions and tomorrow's promises. Harold Pembridge adjusted his Italian leather briefcase and stepped around the janitor without acknowledgement, the way one might avoid a puddle. The lift doors whispered shut, carrying Harold toward his corner office, Marcus's old corner office, while Marcus himself remained in the lobby, methodically polishing the marble floors that had once reflected his confident stride. "Bloody hell, someone needs to tell that old codger to use less bleach," Harold muttered to his reflection in the ascending lift's mirrored walls. "Place smells like a swimming pool." If Harold had bothered to turn around, he might have noticed the slight smile that crossed Marcus's weathered face. But Harold Pembridge, like most people ascending in the world, had developed the peculiar blindness that comes with altitude. Everything below became increasingly invisible. Marcus had been dead for 18 months now. Officially, that is. The obituary in the Times had been impressively verbose for a man who had supposedly built his fortune from nothing. Marcus Williams, 52, visionary entrepreneur and philanthropist, passed away suddenly from complications following a stroke. His revolutionary approach to urban development transformed London's skyline and provided affordable housing to thousands. He leaves behind no immediate family. The bit about no immediate family was technically true, though it stung with the particular precision of facts that omit entire emotional landscapes. Marcus had no children, no siblings who spoke to him, and his parents had been dead for 15 years. What the obituary didn't mention was Elena, who had been his partner for 3 years until she discovered the thing about the money. It also didn't mention James Hartley, his business partner and closest friend, who had held Marcus's hand in that sterile hospital room and promised to carry on their work. What the obituary definitely did not mention was that Marcus Williams had awakened from his coma 3 days after his own funeral, which created several immediate problems, not least of which was discovering that he no longer legally existed. "The thing is," Dr. Sarah Chen had explained, her clipboard pressed against her chest like armor, "medically speaking, you were dead. Legally speaking, you're still dead. And practically speaking, you're something of a ghost." Marcus had stared at her from his hospital bed, his left side still partially paralyzed, his speech slurred but improving daily. The stroke had aged him decades in weeks. His dark hair now silver, his face carved with new lines, his 6-foot frame somehow shortened by the bend the illness had left in his spine. "So what you're telling me," he had said slowly, the words requiring conscious effort, "is that I'm alive, but have no legal right to exist. I'm telling you that reversing a death certificate is extraordinarily complex, especially when assets have been distributed and legal proceedings completed. Your estate has been settled. Your company has been transferred to your business partner, James Hartley, as per your will. Your personal effects have been donated to charity." Dr. Chen had paused, consulting her clipboard. "I'm also telling you that the media attention from your resurrection would be substantial." Marcus had closed his eyes, listening to the mechanical breathing of the hospital around him. Through the window, London continued its ancient dance of ambition and disappointment, towers reaching toward heaven, while their foundations sank deeper into clay. Somewhere in that forest of glass and steel, Williams and Associates continued to exist without Williams. "What would you recommend, doctor?" "Legally, contact a solicitor immediately. Practically?" She had gestured toward the mirror beside his bed. "Look at yourself, Mr. Williams. You're not the same man who supposedly died. The stroke has altered you significantly. If you walked into your old office today, I doubt your own employees would recognize you." It was then that Marcus Williams had his third death, the death of who he used to be. And like all true deaths, it cleared space for something new to be born. The idea had come to him during the long weeks of physical therapy, watching the invisible people who kept the hospital running, the cleaners who worked through the night, the maintenance staff who fixed broken things while patients slept, the security guards who sat at desks and watched the world through screens. They were essential, ubiquitous, and utterly overlooked, a modern form of invisibility more complete than any magic. What better way to return from the dead than as someone already invisible? Marcus had discharged himself on a Tuesday in November, walking out of the hospital with nothing but the clothes the charity shop had provided: faded jeans, a worn jumper, and shoes that had known several previous owners. He had 17 pounds in his pocket, a body that moved like a damaged machine, and a plan that felt either brilliant or completely mad. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would get a job cleaning the building that used to be his. He would watch. He would learn what had become of his life's work. And perhaps, when he understood what had changed and what had been lost, he would decide whether Marcus Williams deserved to be resurrected. Getting hired as a janitor in his own building had required only minor deception. The facilities management company, Everclean Services, operated with the efficient anonymity of the service industry. They needed bodies that could push mops and empty bins, not extensive background checks. Marcus's new identity was paper-thin but adequate. Michael Walsh, recently redundant, no fixed address, references from a fictional cleaning company in Birmingham that existed only as a mobile phone number. Marcus answered in a slightly different accent. "You're overqualified," Karen from Everclean had said during his interview in a coffee shop near Victoria Station. She was reviewing his fabricated CV with the weary expression of someone who had seen too many desperate people. "Most of our clients prefer workers who won't get bored and disappear after a month." "I'm not most people," Marcus had replied, which was true in ways Karen couldn't possibly imagine. The Williams building is a good contract. 23 floors, mostly offices, some executive suites. You'd be working nights, 5 days a week. The pay is minimum wage, but it's steady work. Karen had studied his face, noting the premature aging, the slight droop on his left side. "You sure you can handle the physical requirements?" Marcus had flexed his recovering hand, the movement still requiring conscious thought. "I'm stronger than I look." That had been 4 months ago. Since then, Marcus had developed a routine that would have amused his former self. Each weekday at 5:30 in the morning, he descended into the basement of 47 Grosvenor Street, changed into his coveralls, and began the systematic cleaning of what had once been his empire. He started on the ground floor and worked his way up floor by floor, becoming intimately familiar with the geography of his former life. The building had changed in small ways that spoke to larger transformations. The lobby, once warm with honey-colored wood and soft lighting, had been modernized with stark white surfaces and harsh LED fixtures. The directory beside the lifts now listed companies Marcus didn't recognize. Pembridge Development Holdings, Strategic Urban Solutions, Future Cities Consortium. Williams and Associates still occupied floors 18 through 23, but even that name felt like a historical artifact, like studying the ruins of Rome while the barbarians held Senate meetings. Marcus learned to read buildings the way archaeologists read ancient cities, in layers of evidence, in what remained and what had been discarded. The carpet on floor 12 had been replaced with cheaper material. The artwork in the corridors had been sold and replaced with generic prints. The executive dining room on floor 22 had been converted into additional office space, cramming in 6 desks where there had once been a single table for important meetings. But it was the people that revealed the most dramatic changes. Marcus had expected to recognize some faces from his former life, but the turnover had been nearly complete. Of the 63 employees who had worked for Williams and Associates when he died, only 12 remained. The rest had been made redundant, transferred, or had simply drifted away when the company culture shifted under new management. Harold Pembridge had installed himself not just in Marcus's old office, but in his entire approach to business. Where Marcus had built carefully, focusing on sustainable development and ethical practices, Harold was strip mining for quick profits. Projects that had been designed to last decades were being modified for maximum short-term return. The affordable housing initiative that had been Marcus's proudest achievement was being quietly dismantled, the properties sold to luxury developers. Marcus learned all this by becoming invisible, by existing in the spaces between other people's attention. While he polished conference room tables, he listened to meeting recordings being reviewed. While he emptied wastepaper baskets, He read discarded memos and financial reports. While he restocked supplies in executive offices, he observed this all-eyes, casual cruelty with which Harold conducted business. The transformation was methodical and devastating. Harold wasn't destroying Marcus's life work out of malice. That would have required acknowledging its value. Instead, he was simply replacing it with something more profitable, the way one might renovate a house by gutting everything inside while keeping the same address. 3 months into his new existence, Marcus had witnessed Harold firing Jennifer Morrison, who had been Marcus's head of community outreach. Jennifer had worked for the company for 8 years, had personally overseen the placement of 300 families in affordable housing, and had just returned from maternity leave. "The position has been eliminated," Harold had explained, not looking up from his computer screen. "We're restructuring to focus on core competencies." "What about the community programs?" Jennifer had asked. "The commitments we've made to local councils?" "Those will be handled by external consultants on a project basis. More efficient." Harold had finally looked up, his expression suggesting mild irritation at having to explain obvious business logic. "We're not a charity, Jennifer. We're a development company." Marcus had been emptying Harold's wastepaper basket when this conversation occurred. Invisible in his coveralls and institutional anonymity, Jennifer's eyes had passed over him without recognition, which was perhaps merciful, since she had once presented him with a thank you card from a single mother who had found housing through their program. After Jennifer left, Harold had made a phone call to someone he addressed as "Darling." "Yes, the bleeding heart is gone. We can proceed with the Southwark conversion. The council will complain, but they can't stop us now that we've fulfilled the minimum legal requirements." He had paused, listening. "Of course it's more profitable. We're turning social housing into luxury flats. The margins are extraordinary." That night, Marcus had sat in his small bedsit in Whitechapel, a place that would have horrified his former self, and stared at the wall. The room was 8 feet by 12 feet, with a narrow bed, a desk that doubled as a dining table, and a window that looked onto a brick wall 3 feet away. It was the sort of accommodation he had once fought to improve, the kind of place that represented everything wrong with London's housing crisis. Now it was his home. And he was discovering that poverty was not just about having less money, it was about having fewer choices, fewer opportunities to be wrong, fewer chances to recover from mistakes. When Marcus Williams had made errors, he had redundancies built into his life. Savings accounts, professional networks, family connections. When Michael Walsh made errors, there was only the stark mathematics of survival. But there was also something else, something he hadn't expected, a strange form of freedom. Marcus Williams had been successful, respected, and utterly alone. Michael Walsh was poor, invisible, and slowly learning to see the world from a completely different angle. It was in this new angle of vision that Marcus began to notice Sarah. Sarah Chen, not Dr. Chen, but a different Sarah entirely, worked as a receptionist on the 15th floor for a small architectural firm called Henderson and Partners. She was perhaps 30 years old with short black hair and the kind of precise movements that suggested careful attention to detail. What distinguished her from the dozens of other employees Marcus encountered was simple. She was the only person in the building who acknowledged his existence. "Morning, Michael," she would say when he arrived to empty the bins in her office area. Not loudly, not making a show of it, just a quiet recognition that he was a human being rather than a piece of equipment. "Morning, miss," he would reply, and that would be the extent of their conversation. But it was enough to remind him that he still existed in some social sense, that he wasn't completely invisible. Marcus began to pay attention to Sarah in return. She was always the first to arrive in her office and often the last to leave. She brought lunch from home, usually something simple in a small container, and ate at her desk while reading what appeared to be architectural journals. She was kind to the other employees in small, unobtrusive ways, remembering birthdays, sharing biscuits, listening when people needed to complain about clients or deadlines. But what really caught Marcus's attention was how Sarah handled difficult situations. Henderson and Partners was a struggling firm, and Marcus had observed several tense meetings where clients were demanding work that the company couldn't afford to do for the quoted price. Sarah, despite being officially just a receptionist, had a remarkable ability to diffuse tension and find solutions. She would suggest alternative approaches, identify cost savings, or simply help people see problems from different perspectives. She was, Marcus realized, exactly the kind of employee he had always hoped to find: intelligent, ethical, and genuinely committed to doing good work. She was also completely wasted in her current position, filing papers and answering phones for people who didn't recognize her capabilities. It was during his 4th month as Michael Walsh that Marcus witnessed the conversation that changed everything. Henderson and Partners was in serious financial trouble. Marcus had learned this by reading documents in the partners' wastepaper baskets and overhearing increasingly desperate phone calls. They owed money to contractors, their insurance was about to lapse, and they had 3 major projects that were bleeding money due to poor initial estimates. On a Thursday evening in March, Marcus was cleaning the conference room adjacent to Sarah's desk when he heard raised voices from the partner's office. The walls were thin, and sound carried easily through the ventilation system. "We have to let her go," David Henderson was saying. "Sarah's salary is one of our few controllable expenses." "She's the best employee we have," his partner Michael Graves replied. "She knows our systems, our clients trust her, and she's been carrying half the administrative load." "I'm not questioning her value. I'm questioning whether we can afford value right now. We need to survive the next 3 months, and that means cutting everything that isn't absolutely essential." Sarah is absolutely essential. Sarah is a luxury we can't afford. We can manage phones and filing ourselves until we're back on solid ground. Marcus paused in his cleaning, mop handle gripped tightly in hands that had once signed budgets larger than most people's mortgages. Through the small window in the conference room door, he could see Sarah at her desk, working late again, unaware that her employers were discussing her future in the next room. "When?" Graves asked, his voice defeated. "Tomorrow. Best to do it on Friday. Give her the weekend to process it. We'll give her 2 weeks' pay in lieu of notice. This is going to destroy our operation. This is going to save our operation. Sometimes you have to cut off a finger to save the hand." Marcus finished cleaning the conference room in mechanical silence, his mind racing through calculations he hadn't made in months. Henderson and Partners was failing not because they lacked talent, but because they lacked capital and strategic vision. Their projects were good. Marcus had seen the plans they were developing, but they were pricing themselves out of competitiveness while simultaneously underestimating costs. It was exactly the kind of business problem Marcus Williams would have solved with a few phone calls and a modest investment. But Marcus Williams was dead, and Michael Walsh earned £7.50 an hour emptying bins. Unless. That night, Marcus sat in his small room and stared at a problem that felt like a puzzle box with pieces scattered across 2 different lives. He had knowledge, experience, and connections, but no legal identity to use them. He had witnessed injustice and incompetence, but no obvious way to address them. He had found someone worth helping, but no resources to offer. What he did have was time, proximity, and the invisible access that came with being society's ignored machinery. He also had something else, something he hadn't possessed as Marcus Williams: desperation. Not the clean theoretical desperation of business challenges, but the raw, personal desperation of someone who had lost everything and was slowly building a life from discarded pieces. By morning, Michael Walsh had a plan. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't legal in any traditional sense, and it would require him to perform several kinds of resurrection simultaneously. But it was the first thing in months that felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. The plan began with a phone call. Marcus waited until Friday afternoon, after Sarah had been let go with the promised 2 weeks' pay, and the kind of awkward, apologetic conversation that makes everyone involved feel terrible. He watched her pack her small collection of personal items, a plant, a mug, some photographs, and leave Henderson and Partners for what she assumed was the final time. Then he went to a phone box on Tottenham Court Road and made a call that would have been impossible to explain to anyone who asked. Hartley Development, James Hartley's office. "This is Michael Walsh from Financial Research Associates. I'd like to schedule a meeting with Mr. Hartley regarding investment opportunities in the architectural sector." The lie came easily, backed by Marcus's intimate knowledge of how such conversations worked. Financial Research Associates was a real company. Marcus had done business with them several times, but they had no employee named Michael Walsh. However, the receptionist wouldn't know that. and by the time anyone thought to check, the meeting would be over. "What sort of investment opportunities?" the receptionist asked. "Distressed architectural firms with good project portfolios but poor financial management. We've identified several potential acquisitions in central London. Mr. Hartley is very busy this month. The Henderson and Partners opportunity won't wait. If Mr. Hartley isn't interested, we'll approach Pembridge Development directly." There was a pause. Marcus knew that James would recognize the name Harold Pembridge and would want to know what Harold might be planning. Competitive intelligence was as valuable as actual intelligence in the development business. "Mr. Hartley could see you Tuesday at 3 o'clock. "Perfect. Please tell him I'll bring full financial analysis and project portfolios." Marcus hung up and immediately went to an internet cafe where he spent the next 4 hours creating documents that would have made his former self proud. Using free financial templates and his detailed knowledge of Henderson and Partners' situation, he prepared a comprehensive analysis of their business, their debts, their assets, and their potential value under different management scenarios. Thord's analysis was professionally accurate because Marcus knew how to read companies the way others read books. More importantly, it was compelling because it told a story about wasted potential and overlooked opportunities that James Hartley would find irresistible. By Sunday evening, Marcus had everything he needed except the most important element, confidence. He had been Michael Walsh for 4 months, had learned to move through the world as someone invisible and powerless. Now he needed to convince James Hartley, his former business partner and closest friend, that Michael Walsh was someone worth listening to, without revealing that Michael Walsh was actually Marcus Williams returned from the dead. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday at 3 o'clock. On Tuesday at 2:45, Marcus stood outside the building that had once been his, wearing the only decent clothes he owned, a charity shop suit that fit poorly and shoes that had been resoled twice, and tried to remember how to be someone who mattered. The receptionist directed him to a meeting room on the 19th floor, a space Marcus had designed himself for exactly this type of conversation. James arrived 5 minutes late, which was unlike him but might have been a power play for an unknown consultant. "Mr. Walsh." James extended his hand, and Marcus shook it carefully, wondering if some unconscious recognition would betray him. But James looked through him with the polite attention he gave to all potentially useful strangers. Marcus had forgotten how much the stroke had changed him. Looking at James, still fit, still confident, still carrying himself with the easy authority of success, Marcus realized how completely his transformation had disguised him. James was seeing a slightly bent older man with gray hair and charity shop clothes, not the friend who had supposedly died 18 months ago. "Thank you for meeting with me, Mr. Hartley. I believe Henderson and Partners represents an exceptional opportunity." Marcus opened his folder and began presenting his analysis. Within minutes, he could see James's attention sharpen. The numbers were solid, the strategic thinking was sophisticated, and the opportunity was real. "Where did you get this information?" James asked, studying the financial projections. "Publicly available records, industry contacts, and careful observation. Henderson and Partners is failing due to cash flow problems, not fundamental business issues. Their project portfolio is actually quite strong. And you're proposing a structured acquisition. Hartley Development purchases Henderson and Partners assets and contracts for approximately £60,000, enough to cover their immediate debts. You retain their best employee, absorb their projects, and gain entry to the small-scale architectural development market." James leaned back in his chair, the same gesture Marcus had seen him make hundreds of times when considering a complex decision. "What's your interest in this transaction, Mr. Walsh?" This was the crucial moment, the place where the entire plan could collapse. Marcus had prepared for this question, but preparation felt inadequate when facing his oldest friend across a conference table. "I'm a consultant. I identify opportunities and facilitate transactions. If you proceed with this acquisition, I would expect a finder's fee of 5% of the purchase price. £3,000. £3,000. Marcus nodded. Plus consideration for ongoing consulting work, if the acquisition proves successful. James studied the documents again, then looked directly at Marcus with the sharp attention he brought to important decisions. "This is excellent work, Mr. Walsh, very thorough, very professional. But I have to ask, why bring this to me instead of pursuing it yourself?" Marcus had anticipated this question too, but the answer still required him to reveal more truth than felt safe. Because I don't have 60,000 pounds, Mr. Hartley, and because I believe some opportunities require the right people, not just the right resources. Meaning? Meaning Henderson and Partners is failing because their principals are excellent architects but poor business managers. You're an excellent business manager who understands construction and development. The fit is natural. James was quiet for nearly a minute, reading through the analysis one more time. Marcus waited, listening to the sounds of his former building. Around him, phones ringing, conversations in hallways, the distant hum of air conditioning systems he had once approved for installation. "I'll need to verify this information independently," James finally said. "Of course. And I'll need to meet with Henderson and Partners myself before making any commitments. I would expect nothing less. But assuming everything checks out..." James closed the folder and looked at Marcus directly. "Yes. This is exactly the kind of opportunity we've been looking for. Small enough to manage personally, profitable enough to justify the attention, and aligned with our long-term strategic goals." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since waking up in the hospital. It was the feeling of being useful again, of applying his skills to problems that mattered. But it was also something else, the strange satisfaction of helping people who had no idea they were being helped. "There's one additional element I'd like to propose," Marcus said. "Yes?" "Henderson and Partners has an exceptional employee named Sarah Chen. She was made redundant last week, but she has remarkable skills that are being wasted in administrative roles. If you acquire the company, I'd strongly recommend retaining her in a more senior capacity." James raised an eyebrow. "You seem to know quite a bit about their internal operations. I make it my business to understand the human resources involved in any acquisition. Sarah Chen is the kind of employee who can make or break a small operation. I'll keep that in mind." They shook hands again, and Marcus left the building with 3,000 pounds promised and a plan that was beginning to work. More importantly, he left with the knowledge that he could still solve problems, still create value, still matter in the world, even as someone who officially didn't exist. But as he walked back toward the underground station, Marcus realized that helping James acquire Henderson and Partners was only the beginning. He had glimpsed the full scope of what Harold Pembridge was doing to his life's work, and a single small acquisition wouldn't address the larger catastrophe. Marcus Williams had spent 20 years building something meaningful. Harold Pembridge was systematically destroying it for short-term profit. And somewhere between those two realities, Michael Walsh was learning that resurrection might require more than simply returning from the dead. It might require deciding what deserved to be reborn. The acquisition of Henderson and Partners went smoothly. James's due diligence confirmed everything in Marcus's analysis, and the transaction closed within 3 weeks. Sarah Chen was indeed retained, promoted to project coordinator, and proved exactly as valuable as Marcus had predicted. Michael Walsh received his finder's fee and was invited to submit additional opportunities for review, but Marcus was already working on something larger. For 6 months, he had been invisible in his own building, observing Harold's methodical destruction of everything he had built. Now he understood that being invisible might be the perfect position from which to fight back. Harold couldn't defend against an enemy he couldn't see, couldn't anticipate strategies from someone he didn't. No existed, Marcus Williams was dead. But Michael Walsh was very much alive, and he was beginning to understand that the best revenge might not be revealing the truth. It might be using the truth to build something better than what had been lost. The question was whether he could do it before Harold's damage became irreversible, and whether the person he was becoming in the process would still deserve the name he had once carried. 3 floors above the basement where he sorted recycling each morning, Harold Pembridge was planning the final phase of his renovations. Marcus had read the proposals in Harold's wastepaper basket. Williams and Associates would be dissolved entirely, its assets transferred to Pembridge Development Holdings, and its commitment to affordable housing would be officially terminated. The Kiana bronze plaque in the lobby, the one that read Williams and Associates, founded 1987, was scheduled to be removed next month. Marcus had 30 days to decide whether Marcus Williams deserved a 4th death or whether it was time for a different kind of resurrection entirely. But first, he had bins to empty and floors to clean. Because invisible people, he had learned, saw everything while being seen by no one. And sometimes that was exactly the right position from which to change the world. The bronze plaque disappeared on a Tuesday morning while Marcus was cleaning the third-floor bathrooms. By the time he descended to the lobby for his afternoon rounds, the wall beside the executive lift showed only 4 small holes where the mounting screws had been, and a slightly darker rectangle of marble where Williams and Associates, founded 1987, had protected the stone from 18 years of London grime. Harold Pembridge stood beside the reception desk, supervising 2 workmen who were installing a new sign, Pembridge Development Holdings, Building Tomorrow's London. The lettering was aggressive and modern, all sharp angles and metallic finish, the kind of design that announced ambition without suggesting any particular competence to fulfill it. "Make sure it's perfectly level," Harold instructed, apparently oblivious to the janitor mopping nearby. "This lobby is the first impression investors see. Everything must convey absolute professionalism." Marcus continued cleaning, his movements methodical and invisible, while something cold and sharp crystallized in his chest. Harold wasn't just erasing Marcus's work. He was erasing Marcus himself, removing even the small historical acknowledgement that someone named Williams had once existed in this space. That evening, Marcus sat in his bedsit and made a decision that would have horrified both his former self and his current employer. He was going to commit several serious crimes. Not the clean, theoretical crimes of corporate malfeasance that happened in boardrooms and could be explained away by lawyers, but actual prosecutable offenses that would land Michael Walsh in prison if he was caught. The plan that emerged over the following weeks was complex enough to require multiple notebooks, which Marcus kept hidden beneath his mattress like a teenager hoarding contraband. It involved 3 separate but interconnected strategies, each designed to exploit Harold's weaknesses while leveraging Marcus's unique advantages as someone who was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. Phase 1 was intelligence gathering, which Marcus had been conducting informally for months but now approached with systematic rigor. His position as night janitor gave him access to every office, every wastepaper basket, every carelessly discarded document in the building. More importantly, his invisibility meant he could be present during conversations that would never happen, in front of witnesses who mattered. Harold's operation, Marcus discovered, was even more corrupt than he'd initially realized. The affordable housing projects weren't just being abandoned, they were being deliberately sabotaged to create legal justifications for conversion to luxury development. Families were being evicted through technical violations of their lease agreements. Planning applications were being submitted with false information. Environmental impact studies were being falsified. But Harold's greatest vulnerability was his arrogance. He conducted illegal business openly because he believed the only people who might overhear him were either complicit or powerless. He never suspected that the bent figure emptying his wastepaper basket might be documenting every detail of his criminal enterprises. Phase 2 was sabotage, but sabotage with surgical precision. Marcus didn't want to destroy Pembridge Development Holdings. He wanted to expose it, which required keeping Harold's operation functional long enough to document its crimes while simultaneously undermining its effectiveness. Marcus began with small disruptions that would appear accidental or technical. Computer files were corrupted in ways that required time-consuming reconstruction. Important documents were misfiled or accidentally discarded. Phone messages were lost or delayed. Meeting schedules were confused through mysterious calendar glitches. None of these problems were dramatic enough to suggest deliberate interference, but together they created a pattern of inefficiency that began to frustrate Harold's clients and partners. Projects fell behind schedule. Communications broke down. Deadlines were missed for reasons no one could adequately explain. Harold responded by hiring additional administrative staff and upgrading the company's IT systems, which actually made Marcus's job easier since more people meant more opportunities for confusion, and newer systems meant more complex ways for things to go wrong. But Phase 3 was the most dangerous element of Marcus's plan: active impersonation. Michael Walsh was going to become Marcus Williams, not by revealing his true identity, but by creating a fictional version of his former self who could intervene in situations where a janitor would be powerless. The first test came when Harold scheduled a meeting with the Southwark Council to discuss converting the Millfield estate a social housing project that had been Marcus's proudest achievement, into luxury flats. The meeting was set for a Thursday afternoon, and Marcus knew from reading Harold's correspondence that the council members were under significant financial pressure to approve the conversion. On Wednesday evening, Marcus called the council offices from a payphone in King's Cross. "This is Marcus Williams," he said, using his natural voice for the first time in months. "I'm calling about tomorrow's meeting regarding the Millfield estate." "Mr. Williams?" The receptionist sounded confused. "I thought, weren't you— I was ill for some time, but I'm recovering. I understand Harold Pembridge has been representing himself as having authority over my projects. I need to clarify the legal situation before any irreversible decisions are made." It was a careful lie that relied on bureaucratic confusion and the human tendency to avoid asking uncomfortable questions. The receptionist, faced with someone claiming to be a supposedly dead man, chose the path of least resistance and transferred the call to Counselor Margaret Finch, who was chairing the meeting. "Mr. Williams, this is quite unexpected. We were told you had passed away." "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," Marcus said, borrowing Mark Twain's famous line. "I was hospitalized following a stroke, and during my recovery, Mr. Pembridge appears to have exceeded his authority regarding several of our joint projects." "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that any agreements made regarding the Millfield estate should be postponed until the legal ownership questions can be resolved. I'll be sending documentation to clarify the situation." Marcus hung up. Before Counselor Finch could ask questions he couldn't answer, then spent the rest of the evening creating documents that would support his fictional resurrection. Using templates from legal websites and his intimate knowledge of the original Millfield contracts, he produced letters from fictional solicitors, medical discharge papers from imaginary hospitals, and sworn statements from non-existent witnesses. They're white. Documents were forgeries, but they were sophisticated forgeries that raised enough legitimate questions to force postponement of Harold's meeting. More importantly, they established the precedent that Marcus Williams might still be alive, which would be crucial for later phases of his plan. Harold's reaction was explosive and enlightening. Marcus observed it firsthand while cleaning Harold's office the following evening, listening to a phone conversation that revealed the true scope of his former partner's betrayal. "I don't care what some council bureaucrat thinks she heard," Harold was saying. "Marcus Williams is dead. I have death certificates, probate documents, and 18 months of business operations that prove it." "But what if he isn't dead?" The voice on the other end was tinny but audible through Harold's expensive speakerphone. "What if he's been in some sort of extended care facility and is now trying to reclaim his assets?" "Then we accelerate our timeline. The Millfield conversion needs to happen before anyone can challenge our authority. How quickly can we get the demolition crews mobilized?" "If you're willing to pay overtime rates, we could begin next week. Do it, and make sure the demolition is comprehensive. Once those buildings are down, it won't matter what legal challenges emerge. You can't resurrect demolished property." Marcus felt his hands tighten on the mop handle as the full horror of Harold's plan became clear. He wasn't just stealing Marcus's work, he was destroying it so thoroughly that even a successful legal challenge couldn't restore what had been lost. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, revealing a conspiracy that involved falsified inspection reports, bribed demolition permits, and a deliberate plan to eliminate physical evidence of the original social housing project. By the time Harold ended the call, Marcus had documented enough criminal activity to justify multiple prosecutions. But documentation without proof would be worthless, and proof without legal standing would be insufficient. Marcus needed evidence that would hold up in court, presented by someone who officially existed and had legal authority to act. The solution came to him during his morning cleaning rounds, while emptying the wastepaper basket in Sarah Chen's new office at Henderson and Partners. Sarah had been promoted twice since James's acquisition of the company, first to project coordinator and then to associate partner, a position that reflected both her exceptional abilities and James's recognition of Marcus's original assessment. But what caught Marcus's attention wasn't Sarah's success. It was a letter she had written to the London Housing Authority, proposing a new model for sustainable social housing development. The letter was beautifully crafted, professionally persuasive, and demonstrated exactly the kind of ethical vision that Marcus had once tried to implement through Williams and Associates. Sarah Chen, Marcus realized, wasn't just an excellent employee, she was his natural successor, someone who could carry forward the work he had started while possessing the legal standing and moral authority that Michael Walsh lacked. The plan that emerged was audacious, even by the standards of Marcus's recent criminal activities. He was going to give Sarah Chen everything she needed to destroy Harold Pembridge and resurrect the principles that Marcus Williams had died trying to defend. But he was going to do it in a way that made her the hero of the story, while keeping Michael Walsh safely invisible in the background. The first step was establishing contact. Marcus had been observing Sarah for months, but always from the position of invisible service worker. Now he needed to approach her as someone with valuable information, which required creating another fictional identity. On a Friday afternoon, Marcus called Henderson and Partners from a phone box in Camden. "This is David Thompson from the London Housing Research Institute. I'd like to speak with Sarah Chen about her recent proposal to the Housing Authority." "I'm sorry, but I don't think we've heard of your organization," the receptionist said. Marcus had prepared for this. "We're a small think tank focused on sustainable urban development. Ms. Chen's proposal was forwarded to us by someone at the Housing Authority who thought we might be interested in collaborating. I have some information that might be relevant to her work." The London Housing Research Institute didn't exist, but it sounded plausible enough to get Marcus transferred to Sarah's office. "Ms. Chen, I understand you're working on innovative approaches to social housing development." "Yes, though I should mention that I'm fairly new to this area. My background is more in administrative coordination." Marcus smiled at her modesty. "Sometimes fresh perspectives are exactly what's needed. I have some documentation about historical social housing projects in London that might inform your current work. Would you be interested in meeting to discuss potential collaboration?" They arranged to meet the following Tuesday at a cafe in Bloomsbury, neutral territory where Marcus could control the conversation without revealing too much about his fictional identity. Marcus spent the weekend preparing for the most important performance of his new life. He needed to be David Thompson, housing researcher, convincingly enough to establish credibility with Sarah, while simultaneously providing her with information that would expose Harold's crimes. But he couldn't be so convincing that Sarah might later try to verify his identity or contact his non-existent organization. The balance required careful calibration. David Thompson needed to be knowledgeable but not expert, helpful but not intrusive, interested in Sarah's work but not suspiciously invested in her success. On Tuesday afternoon, Marcus sat in the cafe wearing his charity shop suit and carrying a folder of documents that represented weeks of careful preparation. When Sarah arrived, punctual, professional, carrying her own folder of notes, he stood to greet her with the nervous energy of someone meeting a potential collaborator. "Ms. Chen, thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Sarah shook his hand and studied his face with the careful attention she brought to all new situations. Marcus wondered if she would recognize him from his brief appearances in her office. But her expression showed only polite professional interest. "I have to admit, Mr. Thompson, I'm curious about your organization. I couldn't find much information about the London Housing Research Institute online." Marcus had prepared for this too. "We're quite small, only 3 full-time researchers. Most of our work is commissioned by councils and housing associations, so we don't maintain much of a public profile. But your proposal caught our attention, because it addresses some of the same issues we've been studying." He opened his folder and removed the first document, a historical analysis of social housing in Southwark that he had compiled using public records and his personal knowledge of the area's development patterns. "This is background research on the Millfield estate, which is currently under threat of demolition. The original development represented some innovative approaches to sustainable community building, but those innovations are being ignored in favor of short-term profit maximization." Sarah accepted the document and began reading immediately, her attention focusing with the intensity Marcus had observed during their brief interactions in the office building. After several minutes, she looked up with genuine interest. "This is excellent research, Mr. Thompson, very thorough, but I have to ask, how did you know I was interested in the Millfield situation?" This was the crucial moment. Marcus needed to provide enough information to establish his credibility while avoiding questions about sources or methods. The housing development community in London is smaller than people realize. When someone submits a proposal as thoughtful as yours, word spreads quickly among people who care about these issues. He paused, then added, I also have reason to believe that the Millfield demolition involves some questionable practices that might interest someone with your ethical standards. What sort of questionable practices? Marcus removed a second document from his folder, a carefully edited version of the evidence he had gathered about Harold's criminal activities. Names and identifying details had been changed, but the substance of the corruption was documented with precision. Falsified inspection reports, bribed permits, deliberate displacement of tenants through technical lease violations, the kind of systematic abuse that destroys communities for private profit. Sarah read through the document with growing concern, her professional composure gradually giving way to genuine outrage. This is horrific. If this is accurate, it represents massive violations of housing law and tenant protection regulations. It's accurate. The question is, what can be done about it? Well, obviously, this needs to be reported to the appropriate authorities. The housing authority, the local council, probably the police fraud department. Marcus leaned forward slightly, allowing some of his genuine passion to show through David Thompson's careful neutrality. Ms. Chen, I've been researching housing issues for 15 years. I've seen dozens of reports filed with appropriate authorities, and I've watched most of them disappear into bureaucratic processes that favor developers with expensive lawyers over tenants with legitimate grievances. So what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that sometimes justice requires more than just filing reports. Sometimes it requires people with legal standing and moral authority to take direct action. Sarah studied his face carefully, and Marcus could see her evaluating both his words and his motivations. Mr. Thompson, are you asking me to do something illegal? I'm asking you to do something effective. Everything I'm suggesting is completely legal. It just requires someone who's willing to act rather than simply report. Marcus opened his folder again and removed the final document, a comprehensive plan for challenging Harold's activities through legal channels, media exposure, and community organizing. It was the kind of strategy that Marcus Williams might have implemented if he had still existed, adapted for someone with Sarah's skills and position. This is a roadmap for stopping the Millfield demolition and exposing the broader pattern of corruption. It requires someone with architectural knowledge, community connections, and the courage to challenge powerful interests. Sarah read through the plan with the same focused attention she had brought to the previous documents. Marcus watched her expression change as she absorbed the scope and sophistication of the strategy. This is incredibly detailed. Professional quality work. Who exactly are you, Mr. Thompson? The question Marcus had been dreading and preparing for since the beginning of their conversation. I'm someone who believes that good people with the right resources can change systems that seem impossibly corrupt. I'm also someone who has learned that sometimes the most effective action comes from unexpected places. It wasn't really an answer, but it was true enough to satisfy Sarah's immediate concerns while avoiding the larger questions that Marcus couldn't address without revealing his true identity. And you want me to implement this plan? I want you to consider whether someone with your skills and principles might be uniquely positioned to make a difference in this situation. Sarah closed the folder and looked directly at Marcus with the kind of penetrating attention that made him understand why she had been so effective in her new role at Henderson & Partners. Mr. Thompson, I appreciate your confidence in my abilities, but I'm an architectural coordinator, not a crusading investigative journalist. What you're describing would require resources, connections, and expertise that I simply don't have. Marcus had anticipated this objection too. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card that had cost him 3 hours at an internet cafe and £20 at a professional printing service. David Thompson, Senior Research Associate, Sarah read aloud, London Housing Research Institute. She looked up at Marcus. This has your mobile number. Call me if you decide to move forward with any aspect of this plan. I can provide additional research, documentation, and strategic support. Think of me as a resource rather than a collaborator. Why? Sarah asked. What's your interest in this situation? What do you gain from helping me challenge Harold Pembridge? It was the most dangerous question she could have asked because the honest answer would have destroyed everything Marcus was trying to accomplish. But it was also the question that revealed why Sarah Chen was exactly the right person to carry forward his work. She understood that motivations mattered as much as methods. Marcus looked across the table at this remarkable woman who had somehow maintained her integrity and compassion while working in an industry that often rewarded neither quality, and decided to give her as much truth as he could safely offer. Ms. Chen, I've spent my career watching good ideas get destroyed by people who mistake cynicism for sophistication and greed for wisdom. Harold Pembridge represents everything that's wrong with modern development. He's destroying communities and calling it progress. He's displacing families and calling it efficiency. He's eliminating affordable housing and calling it market forces. He paused, surprised by how much emotion had crept into David Thompson's supposedly neutral voice. I'm helping you because I believe you represent everything that's right with modern development. You understand that buildings are more than investments, that communities are more than markets, that housing is more than commodity. The question isn't what I gain from helping you. The question is, what London loses if people like Harold Pembridge are allowed to operate without challenge? Sarah was quiet for nearly a minute, studying both Marcus and the documents he had given her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the kind of quiet determination that Marcus had learned to recognize as the most dangerous quality in business. Mr. Thompson, I'll need to verify some of this information independently before I can act on it. Of course. And I'll need to discuss this with my partners at Henderson & Partners. This kind of action could affect our entire company. I would expect nothing less. But if this documentation is accurate... Sarah closed the folder and met Marcus's eyes directly. If Harold Pembridge is really doing what you've described, then someone needs to stop him. And if you're right about my being uniquely positioned to take action, then I have a responsibility to try. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. The same sensation he had experienced when James agreed to acquire Henderson & Partners. It was the feeling of setting something important in motion, of creating the possibility for justice in a situation that had seemed hopeless. There's one more thing, Marcus said, removing a final document from his folder. This is a list of families who are currently living in the Millfield estate. Names, addresses, employment situations, children's schools. If the demolition proceeds, these aren't just housing units being destroyed. These are lives being disrupted, Sarah accepted the list and read through it with growing concern. Marcus had compiled it by walking through the estate on weekends, talking to residents as Michael Walsh, the invisible janitor who had time to listen to people's stories. 43 families, Sarah said. 112 people, including 37 children. Harold Pembridge sees numbers on a profit projection. I thought you might want to see the actual human cost of his decisions. It was a calculated emotional appeal, but it was also completely honest. Marcus had met these families, had listened to their concerns about gentrification and displacement, had seen their children playing in courtyards that would soon be rubble. Sarah folded the list carefully and placed it in her bag along with the other documents Marcus had provided. Mr. Thompson, I can't promise anything except that I'll investigate this situation thoroughly and act according to my best judgment. That's all anyone can ask. They shook hands again, and Marcus watched Sarah leave the cafe with the strange satisfaction of someone who had successfully given away something valuable. She carried his documents, his strategy, and his hopes in her professional bag, but she had no idea that she was also carrying the resurrection of Marcus Williams. Over the following weeks, Marcus watched Sarah's investigation unfold from his invisible position in the building that had once been his. She worked with methodical precision, verifying every detail in Marcus's documentation while building her own network of sources and evidence. She contacted residents of the Millfield estate, documenting their concerns about the planned demolition. She reviewed public records at the council offices, confirming the discrepancies Marcus had identified in Harold's permit applications. She consulted with housing law experts, establishing the legal framework for challenging Harold's activities. Most impressively, she began building a coalition of organizations and individuals who could support a comprehensive challenge to Harold's development plans. The London Tenants Union, 3 different housing charities, 2 investigative journalists, and a law firm that specialized in tenant rights cases. Marcus observed all of this through his network of invisible access, overhearing phone calls while cleaning offices, reading correspondence in wastepaper baskets, watching meetings through conference room windows. Sarah was implementing his strategy with modifications and improvements that demonstrated exactly why she was the right person for this work. But Harold was also responding to the increased scrutiny, and his response was characteristically ruthless. Marcus learned about it while cleaning Harold's office on a Thursday evening, listening to a conversation that revealed the true danger of the situation they had created. "The Chen woman is becoming a serious problem," Harold was telling someone, over his secure phone line. "She's contacted half the housing advocates in London, and she has documentation that shouldn't exist." What kind of documentation? Internal memos, financial projections, correspondence with city officials. Someone is feeding her information from inside our operation. Marcus felt his blood pressure spike as he realized that Harold was actively investigating the source of Sarah's information. If Harold discovered that his own janitor was the mysterious housing researcher providing strategic intelligence to his enemies, "Have you identified the source?" "Not yet, but we're conducting a comprehensive security review. All employees, all contractors, all service providers. Someone with access to confidential information is working against us." "What about the demolition timeline?" "We're accelerating everything. If we can get the buildings down before this coalition of bleeding hearts can get legal injunctions in place, the whole controversy becomes moot." Marcus continued cleaning while his mind raced through calculations of timing and risk. Harold was moving faster than anticipated, which meant Sarah's legal challenges might not develop quickly enough to prevent the demolition. More immediately, Harold's security investigation meant that Michael Walsh's cover identity was in serious jeopardy. It was time for Phase 4 of Marcus's plan, the phase he had hoped to avoid because it required him to take personal risks that could expose everything he had accomplished so far. Marcus Williams was going to have to make a public appearance. Not as Michael Walsh, the invisible janitor, and not as David Thompson, the fictional housing researcher, but as himself, the supposedly dead founder of Williams & Associates, returned to stop the destruction of his life's work. The risk was enormous. If Marcus appeared publicly as himself, he would have to explain where he had been for 18 months, why his death had been faked, and how he had survived without legal identity or financial resources. The media attention would be intense, the legal complications would be massive, and there was no guarantee that his resurrection would actually stop Harold's plans. But the alternative was watching Harold destroy the Millfield estate while Sarah's coalition struggled with legal processes that might take months to resolve. 43 families would be displaced, a successful model of sustainable social housing would be eliminated, and Harold would move on to the next profitable demolition. Marcus spent his weekend preparing for the most important performance of any of his lives. He needed to become Marcus Williams again, not just in name, but in presence, authority, and credibility. The stroke had changed his appearance significantly, but it hadn't eliminated his knowledge, his connections, or his understanding of how power actually operated in London's development industry. On Monday morning, instead of reporting to work, as Michael Walsh, Marcus put on his best charity shop suit and walked into the offices of the Guardian newspaper. "I'd like to speak with someone about exposing a major housing scandal," he told the receptionist. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I have information about systematic fraud in social housing development, and I have evidence that demolition crews are planning to destroy critical evidence later this week." The receptionist studied his appearance, the cheap suit, the gray hair, the slight stoop that remained from his stroke, and Marcus could see her calculating whether he was a legitimate source or simply another conspiracy theorist with a folder of grievances. "What's your name, sir?" Marcus took a breath and committed himself to whatever consequences would follow. "My name is Marcus Williams. I'm supposed to be dead, but I'd like to discuss that situation with someone who understands investigative journalism." 20 minutes later, Marcus was sitting across from Rebecca Morrison, senior investigative reporter, explaining the most impossible story of her career. Rebecca was perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of sharp attention that comes from years of separating truth from deception in a profession where both are regularly offered with equal conviction. "Mr. Williams, I'm going to need to verify your identity before we can proceed with this conversation." Marcus had prepared for this too. He provided details about his business history that only the real Marcus Williams could know, described the internal layout of offices that had been renovated since his supposed death, and offered to submit to DNA testing if necessary. "Assuming you are who you claim to be," Rebecca said, "where have you been for the past 18 months? Marcus had decided to tell as much truth as possible without revealing his activities as Michael Walsh. I was in a coma for several weeks following my stroke. When I recovered, I discovered that I had been declared legally dead and my assets had been distributed. Rather than fight through the legal system immediately, I decided to investigate what had happened to my company during my absence. And what did you discover? Marcus opened his folder, a different folder than the one he had shared with Sarah, but containing some of the same evidence, and began presenting documentation of Harold's criminal activities. Rebecca reviewed the 8 materials with professional skepticism, asking detailed questions about sources and methods. Marcus answered as honestly as he could while protecting both Michael Walsh's identity and Sarah Chen's ongoing investigation. This is substantial evidence of fraud and corruption, Rebecca finally said. But it raises obvious questions about how you obtain this information. Some of these documents appear to be internal corporate communications that wouldn't be accessible to someone outside the organization. Marcus had prepared for this question too, though his answer required careful navigation between truth and necessary deception. Ms. Morrison, I spent 20 years building Williams & Associates. I know every employee, every contractor, every consultant who ever worked with us. When someone is systematically destroying your life's work, you find ways to gather information about what's happening. It was true enough to satisfy immediate journalistic ethics while vague enough to protect his actual sources. What do you want from The Guardian, Mr. Williams? I want you to publish a story that exposes Harold Pembridge's criminal activities before he can destroy the physical evidence. The Millfield estate is scheduled for demolition this week, and once those buildings are down, the families who lived there will have no recourse for the illegal tactics used to displace them. Rebecca closed the folder and studied Marcus with the careful attention he remembered from his previous life, when reporters had interviewed him about his development projects and charitable initiatives. Mr. Williams, if this story is accurate, it's going to create enormous controversy. Your supposed death, your mysterious resurrection, the systematic fraud allegations, this will be front-page news that destroys several careers and probably results in criminal prosecutions. I understand. It will also mean that your own life becomes public property again. Every detail of your business practices, your personal relationships, your medical situation will be subject to media scrutiny. Marcus thought about his small bedsit in Whitechapel, his invisible existence as Michael Walsh, the strange freedom he had found in being no one important. All of that would disappear the moment Rebecca's story appeared in print. Ms. Morrison, 18 months ago, I was someone who mattered in this city's development industry. I built housing for families who couldn't afford market rates. I created communities rather than just apartment blocks, and I believed that business could be a force for social good rather than just private profit. He paused, allowing some of his genuine emotion to show through his careful composure. Harold Pembridge has spent the last year systematically destroying everything I spent 2 decades building. He's displacing families, eliminating affordable housing, and corrupting the entire development process for short-term financial gain. If exposing his crimes requires me to sacrifice my privacy and accept media scrutiny, that seems like a reasonable trade. Rebecca was quiet for several minutes, reviewing Marcus's documentation one more time while evaluating both the story's newsworthiness and its credibility. I'll need to verify this information independently before we can publish anything. Of course, and I'll need to interview Harold Pembridge for his response to these allegations. I would expect nothing less. But Mr. Williams? Rebecca looked directly at Marcus with the kind of serious attention that preceded important commitments. If this documentation is accurate, and if you're really who you claim to be, then this is one of the most significant housing corruption stories I've encountered. The Guardian will give it the full investigative treatment it deserves. Marcus felt the familiar sensation of something important shifting into motion, but this time it was accompanied by the knowledge that he was crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Once Rebecca's story appeared, Michael Walsh would cease to exist, and Marcus Williams would have to reclaim his identity with all the complications and consequences that entailed. But 43 families in the Millfield estate would have a chance to keep their homes. Sarah Chen would have the media support she needed to implement her legal challenges, and Harold Pembridge would finally face accountability for his systematic destruction of everything Marcus had spent his career building. As Marcus left the Guardian offices, he realized that his 4th death was about to become his most important resurrection, not just of his identity, but of his principles, his work, and his commitment to the idea that business could serve communities rather than simply extracting profit from them. The question now was whether Marcus Williams, returned from the dead, would be strong enough to finish what Michael Walsh, the invisible janitor, had started. The Guardian's story broke on a Wednesday morning with the kind of headline that stops London's commuter trains mid-conversation. Dead developer returns to expose housing fraud scandal. By noon, Marcus Williams was trending on social media. Harold Pembridge's office was surrounded by reporters, and the Millfield estate demolition had been suspended pending investigation. Marcus watched the chaos unfold from the same coffee shop in Bloomsbury where he had first met Sarah Chen as David Thompson. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now hiding from media attention, in the same way he had once hidden from Harold's notice, by becoming invisible in plain sight, just another anonymous figure reading newspapers in a crowded cafe. But invisibility, Marcus was learning, becomes impossible once the world decides you matter again. Excuse me, aren't you Marcus Williams? The voice belonged to a young woman with a mobile phone already positioned for photography. Marcus looked up from his newspaper, which featured his own photograph on the front page, a corporate headshot from 5 years ago that made him look like a different person entirely, and realized that his resurrection was about to become significantly more complicated. "I'm sorry, you must have me confused with someone else," he said, adopting Michael Walsh's diffident tone. The woman studied his face with the persistent attention of someone convinced she was right. "No, I'm sure it's you. You look different, but it's definitely you. My mom works in housing advocacy. She says you used to be one of the good developers before you died." Before he died. The phrase carried a weight that Marcus was still learning to navigate. He had spent 18 months being dead, 4 months being invisible, and now he was discovering that being resurrected might be the most difficult identity of all. "Really, I think you're mistaken," Marcus said, standing to leave. "Wait!" The woman's voice carried across the cafe, drawing attention from other patrons. "If you are Marcus Williams, I just wanted to say thank you. My family lived in one of your developments in Bermondsey for 3 years. It was the first place we could afford that actually felt like home." Marcus stopped walking. He turned back to see the woman's face, which had shifted from celebrity hunting excitement to something more genuine. Gratitude mixed with the kind of hope that comes from believing someone powerful might actually care about ordinary people's lives. "What's your name?" Marcus asked, abandoning his pretense of mistaken identity. Emma Rodriguez. We lived in the Riverside Gardens development until my mum got promoted and we could afford something bigger." She paused, studying his face again. "You really are him, aren't you? You're really alive." Marcus sat back down, partly because his legs felt unsteady, and partly because Emma Rodriguez's expression reminded him why he had become a developer in the first place. Before the spreadsheets and planning meetings and corporate politics, there had been a simple idea. Everyone deserved a place to live that felt like home. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'm really alive." Emma sat down across from him with the familiarity of someone who had just confirmed something important. "The news said you've been investigating corruption in your old company. Is that true?" "It's true." "And you found evidence that families are being illegally evicted from social housing?" Marcus nodded, suddenly aware that Emma Rodriguez represented something he hadn't considered in his elaborate plans for exposing Harold's crimes. The actual people who would be affected by the outcome of his resurrection. "Emma, can I ask you something? What happened to your neighbors in Riverside Gardens after your family moved?" Emma's expression darkened. "Most of them were forced out when the management company raised the service charges. They said it was necessary. Maintenance, but everyone knew it was just a way to make the flats too expensive for working families. The whole place is luxury rentals now." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Riverside Gardens had been one of his proudest achievements, a mixed-income development that provided affordable housing while maintaining high design standards. If it had been converted to luxury rentals through artificial service charge increases, that meant Harold's corruption extended far beyond what Marcus had documented. "Emma, I need to ask you to do something that might seem strange. Could you give me the names and contact information for any families you know who were displaced from Riverside Gardens or other Williams & Associates developments?" "Why?" Because I think the Millfield estate isn't the only property where people have been illegally forced out of their homes. And if that's true, then a lot more families deserve justice than I initially realized. Emma spent the next hour calling friends and former neighbors, compiling a list that grew longer and more damning with each conversation. Riverside Gardens, South Bank Commons, the Hackney Cooperative Housing Project. All developments that Marcus had designed as permanent, affordable housing, all gradually converted to market rate or luxury accommodations through tactics that pushed out original residents. By the time Emma finished her calls, Marcus had documentation of systematic displacement affecting more than 200 families across 6 different developments. Harold hadn't just been stealing individual properties, he had been erasing Marcus's entire approach to ethical development, one eviction at a time. "Mr. Williams," Emma said, handing him the completed list. "These families trusted you when they moved into your buildings. They believed someone was finally building housing for people like them rather than just rich people. If what's happening to them is illegal, you have to stop it." Marcus stared at the list of names, addresses, and phone numbers that represented the human cost of Harold's systematic corruption. These weren't abstract victims of corporate malfeasance. These were specific people with children and jobs and hopes for stable housing, all displaced so that Harold could maximize profits from properties they had no legal right to change. "Emma, I'm going to stop it, but I need you to understand that this is going to get complicated and probably dangerous. Harold Pembridge has spent 18 months building a criminal enterprise, and he's not going to surrender it without a fight. What do you need from me?" The question reminded Marcus of Sarah Chen's similar offer to help with the Millfield situation. Both women had responded to evidence of injustice with immediate willingness to act, even when action involved personal risk. It was exactly the quality Marcus had always hoped to find in his employees and partners, and exactly the quality that Harold's operation systematically eliminated. "I need you to help me contact these families and document their experiences. But I also need you to be careful. Harold has resources and connections that make him dangerous to anyone who threatens his business." Emma nodded with the serious attention of someone who understood that she was accepting real responsibility. "Mr. Williams, these families have already lost their homes. The least I can do is help them fight for justice." Marcus gave Emma his mobile number, the same number he had provided to Sarah Chen as David Thompson, and arranged to meet with her again the following day. As she left the cafe, Marcus realized that his resurrection was generating its own momentum, creating connections and obligations that extended far beyond his original plan to save the Millfield estate. His phone rang before he could fully process the implications of this expanding responsibility. "Mr. Williams, this is Rebecca Morrison from The Guardian. We need to talk immediately." "What's happened?" "Harold Pembridge has filed for an emergency injunction claiming that your allegations are part of an elaborate fraud scheme. He's arguing that you're not really Marcus Williams, that you're someone impersonating a dead man for financial gain." Marcus felt the world shift around him as he realized that Harold was using the very implausibility of his resurrection as a weapon against him. Who would believe that someone could fake their own death, live as an invisible janitor, and then return to expose corruption in their former company? The story was so unlikely that it sounded exactly like the kind of elaborate con game that would justify dismissing all evidence as fabricated. What evidence is he presenting? Medical records showing that Marcus Williams suffered catastrophic brain damage and couldn't possibly have recovered enough to conduct the sophisticated investigation described in your documentation. Financial records showing that the real Marcus Williams had no resources to survive 18 months without legal identity, and testimony from multiple employees stating that they would have recognized you if you had been working in their building. Each point was technically accurate and collectively devastating. Marcus had suffered brain damage, he had survived without legitimate resources, and his transformation was so complete that people who had worked with him for years wouldn't recognize him as a janitor. "Rebecca, I can provide DNA evidence, fingerprint verification, and details about my business history that only the real Marcus Williams could know." Harold's lawyers are arguing that someone planning an elaborate fraud would have access to that kind of information through identity theft and corporate espionage. They're demanding that you be arrested for fraud before any of your allegations can be investigated. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to think through the legal implications of Harold's strategy. If Harold could convince a judge that Marcus was an imposter, then all of his evidence would be dismissed as fabricated. Sarah's investigation would lose credibility, and Harold would be free to proceed with his demolition plans, while Marcus faced criminal prosecution. How long do we have? The emergency hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. If Harold gets his injunction, the Guardian will have to retract the story, and you'll probably be arrested by tomorrow afternoon. Marcus hung up and sat in the cafe surrounded by the white noise of London's everyday life. Conversations about work and relationships and weekend plans, the comfortable concerns of people whose identities were never in question and whose existence was never subject to legal challenge. For the first time since waking up in the hospital 18 months ago, Marcus felt genuinely afraid. Not the manageable anxiety of planning complicated deceptions, but the deep fear of someone who realized that everything he had built might collapse because reality had become too strange for the legal system to accept. His phone rang again. Sarah. Chen, Mr. Williams, I just saw the news. I need to tell you something important. I'm listening. I know who you are. I've known since our meeting at the cafe in Bloomsbury. Marcus felt his carefully constructed world shifting again, but this time in a direction he couldn't predict. What do you mean? I mean, I recognized you from the building. You've been cleaning our offices for months. I knew you as Michael Walsh, the janitor who always said good morning and worked harder than anyone else in the building. The revelation should have terrified Marcus, but instead he felt something close to relief. Sarah had known his true identity during their entire collaboration, which meant she had chosen to help him not because of his credentials as David Thompson, but because of his character as Michael Walsh. Sarah, why didn't you say anything? Because it didn't matter who you used to be. What mattered was that you were trying to do the right thing and you needed help to do it effectively. She paused. Also, because I suspected that someone who would fake his own death and work as a janitor for months just to expose corruption was probably someone worth trusting. Marcus laughed despite everything, recognizing that Sarah Chen had understood the essential truth of his situation better than he had himself. His resurrection wasn't about reclaiming his old identity. It was about proving that his principles had survived even when everything else had been lost. Sarah, Harold is claiming that I'm an imposter. He's trying to get an injunction that would stop the investigation and probably get me arrested for fraud. I know. I'm calling because I have an idea, but it's going to require you to trust me completely. I already trust you completely. What's your idea? We're going to prove your identity in a way that Harold can't challenge, and we're going to do it in front of the entire London development community. Sarah's plan was audacious enough to make Marcus's previous schemes seem conservative by comparison. She had organized an emergency meeting of the London Housing Development Council for Thursday evening, the day after Harold's injunction hearing. The meeting would be held in the auditorium of the building center, with representatives from every major development company, housing advocacy organization, and city planning department in London. The agenda is simple, Sarah explained. A presentation on the Millfield Estate corruption scandal, delivered by someone claiming to be Marcus Williams. You'll present your evidence to an audience of people who knew you personally and professionally for 20 years. If you're really Marcus Williams, they'll recognize you despite the physical changes. If you're an imposter, they'll expose you immediately. And if Harold's injunction succeeds, I'll be arrested before I can give the presentation. That's why we're not waiting for the injunction hearing. We're holding the meeting tomorrow night, before Harold's lawyers can stop it. Marcus realized that Sarah was proposing to stake everything, her reputation, her career, her legal standing, on a single public appearance where he would either vindicate his identity or destroy both of their futures. Sarah, if I'm wrong about any of this, if Harold can discredit the evidence or convince people that I'm a fraud, you'll be finished in this industry. Mr. Williams, Marcus, I've spent the last 6 months watching you rebuild your life from nothing while fighting to save other people's homes. I've seen you work 18-hour days as a janitor while planning sophisticated investigations in your spare time. I've watched you sacrifice your own safety to protect families you've never met. Her voice carried the kind of quiet conviction that Marcus had learned to recognize as the most powerful force in business. If someone with that kind of character and commitment isn't Marcus Williams, then maybe it doesn't matter who you used to be. Maybe what matters is who you've become. The London Housing Development Council meeting was held on a Thursday evening in November, 18 months and 3 days after Marcus Williams had supposedly died. The building center auditorium was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in aisles and crowding near doorways to witness what the London Evening Standard had described as either the most remarkable resurrection in business history or the most elaborate fraud scheme in London's development industry. Marcus stood backstage, wearing a borrowed suit that fit better than anything he had owned since his stroke, listening to the murmur of conversations that carried his name like a question mark. Through a gap in the curtains, he could see Harold Pembridge sitting in the front row, flanked by lawyers and surrounded by supporters, who believed they were about to witness the exposure of an elaborate con game. Sarah appeared beside him, carrying the presentation materials they had assembled over the past 24 hours, documentation of Harold's crimes, evidence of systematic tenant displacement, financial records showing the true scope of the corruption they had uncovered. "Are you ready?" she asked. Marcus looked out at the audience of people who had once known him as a successful developer, respected colleague, and innovative thinker. They would see someone who looked decades older, moved with a slight limp, and spoke with the careful precision of someone still recovering from brain injury. They would have to reconcile their memories of Marcus Williams with the reality of what he had become. "Sarah, I need to tell you something before we do this." "What?" "If this doesn't work, if they don't believe I'm really Marcus Williams, I want you to know that working with you has been the most meaningful part of my entire career. You've reminded me why I became a developer in the first place." Sarah smiled with the kind of warmth that had first caught Marcus's attention, when she was simply a receptionist who said good morning to invisible janitors. "Marcus, whether you're the founder of Williams & Associates or just someone who cares deeply about housing justice, you've already succeeded. Look at this room. Hundreds of people willing to spend their evening learning about corruption in social housing development. You've made this issue matter to people who usually only care about profit margins." The introduction was brief and deliberately neutral. Sarah took the stage and explained that someone claiming to be Marcus Williams had presented evidence of systematic fraud in London's social housing sector, and that the London Housing Development Council had called this emergency meeting to evaluate both the evidence and the person presenting it. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present Marcus Williams." Marcus walked onto the stage and looked out at an audience that represented 20 years of his professional life. In the front rows, he recognized colleagues, competitors, city officials, and journalists who had covered his projects. Some faces showed skepticism, others curiosity, and a few showed what might have been recognition. He had prepared elaborate presentations about Harold's criminal activities, detailed financial analyses of the corruption they had uncovered, and comprehensive proposals for reforming London's social housing development processes. But standing in front of people who had once known him, Marcus realized that the most important thing he could offer wasn't evidence or analysis, it was truth. "My name is Marcus Williams," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. 18 months ago, most of you attended my funeral. Tonight, I'd like to explain where I've been since then, what I've learned, and why. The future of ethical development in London depends on understanding both stories. He began with the stroke, the coma, and the bureaucratic nightmare of being declared dead while still alive. He described the decision to remain officially dead rather than fight through legal proceedings that would have taken months while Harold consolidated control over Williams & Associates. But the most important part of my story isn't what happened to Marcus Williams, the successful developer. It's what I learned when I became Michael Walsh, the invisible janitor. Marcus told them about his 4 months cleaning the building that had once been his, watching Harold systematically destroy everything he had spent 20 years building. He described the families being displaced through illegal tactics, the affordable housing being converted to luxury developments, and the systematic corruption that treated people's homes as nothing more than profit opportunities. I learned that being invisible gives you a very different perspective on how our industry actually works. When you're cleaning conference rooms, you hear conversations that would never happen in front of witnesses who matter. When you're emptying waste paper baskets, you read documents that reveal the true cost of business decisions. When you're someone no one notices, you see everything. The audience was completely quiet now, and Marcus could see recognition dawning on faces throughout the auditorium. Not just recognition of his identity, but recognition of the story he was telling, the gap between the industry's public rhetoric about community development and its private practices of profit maximization. Harold Pembridge will tell you that I'm an imposter, that the real Marcus Williams couldn't have survived 18 months without legal identity, that my transformation is too dramatic to be believable. He's right about the transformation. I am a different person than I was before my stroke. But I'm also still the same person who spent 20 years trying to prove that development could serve communities rather than just extracting profit from them. Marcus opened his folder and began presenting the evidence he and Sarah had compiled, not just documentation of Harold's crimes, but a comprehensive analysis of how the corruption extended throughout London's development industry. This isn't just about Harold Pembridge or Williams and Associates. This is about an entire system that has forgotten that housing is about people, not just investments. It's about an industry that talks about community development while systematically displacing communities. It's about the difference between building places where people can live and building assets that generate maximum return. He presented case studies of families displaced through illegal tactics, financial analyses showing how affordable housing was being systematically eliminated, and proposals for reform that would prioritize community stability over developer profit. But it was his final point that transformed the evening from a business presentation into something more personal and urgent. Ladies and gentlemen, I spent 4 months as someone invisible, learning what this industry looks like from the perspective of people who don't matter to our business calculations. I cleaned offices where decisions were made that would destroy hundreds of families' homes. I emptied bins that contained discarded correspondence from tenants begging not to be evicted. I watched meetings where human beings were discussed as obstacles to profit, rather than as the reason development exists in the first place. Marcus paused, looking out at faces that now showed a mixture of recognition, concern, and something that might have been shame. I'm not asking you to believe that Marcus Williams rose from the dead. I'm asking you to believe that someone who cares about this industry's ethical foundation has provided evidence of criminal corruption that demands immediate action. Whether that someone is Marcus Williams or just someone who worked as a janitor long enough to see what we've become, the evidence speaks for itself. The presentation lasted 45 minutes, followed by 90 minutes of questions that ranged from technical inquiries about financial documentation to personal challenges about Marcus's identity and motivations. By the end of the evening, even Harold's supporters seemed convinced that they were dealing with either the real Marcus Williams or the most sophisticated imposter in London's business history. But it was James Hartley's response that provided the moment Marcus had been waiting for since his resurrection began. James stood up in the third row, studied Marcus's face with the careful attention of someone evaluating a crucial business decision, and spoke with the authority of someone who had been Marcus's closest friend for 15 years. Marcus, it's good to have you back. The auditorium erupted in conversation as people realized that James, who had more reason than anyone to expose a fraud claiming to be his supposedly dead business partner, had just confirmed Marcus's identity. Within minutes, other longtime colleagues were approaching the stage to welcome back someone they had mourned 18 months earlier. Harold Pembridge left without speaking to anyone. The legal proceedings that followed were complex but conclusive. DNA testing confirmed Marcus's identity, medical experts verified that his transformation was consistent with stroke recovery, and forensic accountants validated the evidence of systematic fraud that he had compiled during his months as an invisible janitor. Harold was arrested 3 days after the Housing Development Council meeting, charged with fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and violations of tenant protection laws. His criminal enterprise, built on the systematic exploitation of London's most vulnerable residents, collapsed within weeks as investigators uncovered the full scope of his activities. But the most important outcome wasn't Harold's prosecution. It was the transformation of how London approached social housing development. Marcus's evidence had documented problems that extended far beyond any single company, revealing systematic failures in oversight, regulation, and accountability that affected the entire industry. Sarah Chen was appointed to head a new municipal task force on ethical development, with authority to investigate corruption and implement reform throughout London's housing sector. James Hartley restructured his company to focus exclusively on affordable and mixed-income housing, adopting the principles that Marcus had originally brought to Williams and Associates. Most importantly, the families displaced from Millfield Estate, Riverside Gardens, and dozens of other developments received legal representation, financial compensation, and priority placement in new affordable housing projects designed according to Marcus's original vision. 6 months after his resurrection, Marcus stood in the lobby of 47 Grosvenor Street, watching workers install a new bronze plaque beside the executive lift. Williams & Associates Community Development Foundation, founded 2024. Dedicated to the principle that housing is a human right, not a commodity. The foundation occupied the same offices where Marcus had once built his original company, but its mission was broader and more explicit than anything he had attempted in his previous life. Instead of simply developing affordable housing, the Foundation worked to ensure that affordable housing remained permanently affordable, that communities had meaningful input into development decisions, and that people like Harold Pembridge couldn't exploit regulatory loopholes to destroy what others had built. Marcus no longer lived in his small bedsit in Whitechapel. The foundation provided him with a modest flat in one of his original developments, where he could walk to work and remain connected to the communities his work was designed to serve. But he kept the flat simple and unadorned, remembering the lessons he had learned about the difference between having enough and having too much. On a Tuesday morning in spring, Marcus was reviewing applications for the foundation's new affordable housing projects when Sarah knocked on his office door. "Marcus, there's someone here to see you. She says her name is Emma Rodriguez." Emma entered carrying a folder that Marcus recognized as similar to the ones he had once used to document Harold's crimes. But instead of evidence of corruption, Emma's folder contained proposals for tenant-owned cooperative housing, community land trusts, and other innovative approaches to permanent affordability. "Mr. Williams, I've been working with families affected by displacement throughout London. We've learned a lot about what doesn't work in social housing development. Now we'd like to help design what does work." Marcus accepted Emma's folder and realized that his resurrection had accomplished something more important than exposing corruption or stopping demolitions. It had created a network of people who understood that housing could be about community rather than commodity, that development could serve residents rather than just investors, and that business could be a force for justice rather than just profit. "Emma, what do you need from the foundation?" "We need a partner who understands that the people living in housing developments should have a voice in how those developments are designed, managed, and maintained. We need someone who believes that expertise comes from lived experience, not just professional